The study was dark, except for the fire, and the fire had burned down to that low red hour when a house stops pretending to be awake. She stood very still in the middle of the room, with a book held against her chest, and the book was open, and her thumb was pressed flat over a single line of her dead father's handwriting in the margin, as if she could hide it by touching it. Across from her, in the great chair by the hearth, sat the most powerful man she had ever feared, and he could not see her at all. His eyes were turned toward the window, where there was nothing but black glass and the shape of the night. And then he said, in that low and terrible and gentle voice, "Read me that line again, Miss Grey. The one your voice will not finish." And her whole body went cold, because she understood in that single moment that the blind man had been watching her more closely than any seeing person ever had. He knew. He could not see her face, and he knew. And the proof that could destroy him was open in her hands, and the name she had been hiding for 5 years was about to fall out of her mouth, and there was nowhere left in all of England for either of them to go. But I am getting ahead of myself, and that is not how a story like this should be told. Because to understand how a ruined woman came to stand in a blind duke's study at midnight, holding the one thing that could unmake him, you have to go back. You have to go back to a snowless winter 5 years before, to a good house and a kind man and a name that meant something. And you have to let me take you there slowly, because the slow way is the only honest way. So before we go, and we are going, let me ask you something, because you are here, and I like to know who is here. Where in the world are you listening to me from tonight? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Whether it is late and the house has gone quiet around you, or whether it is the middle of an ordinary afternoon and you have simply decided to let me steal you away for a while, I am glad you came. If this is your first time here, my name is Jane, and I tell long stories slowly, the way they used to be told before everyone was in such a hurry. So do me a kindness. Press that subscribe button, settle in, and let me earn the next hour and a half of your life. And if you do not subscribe by the end of this story, well, we will discuss that later. For now, come back with me. The fire is lit, the snow has not yet fallen, and a young woman named Eleanor still has everything to lose. She was Eleanor Hartley then, not Miss Grey. That came after. In those days, she was the only daughter of Sir Thomas Hartley of Wrenfield, in the green and unhurried county of Hampshire. And if you had passed her in the lane, you would have thought, there goes a lucky girl. You would not have been wrong, not then. The Hartleys were not great people in the way the great families counted greatness. They had no London house, no string of titles trailing behind their name like the wake of a ship. What they had was older and quieter than that. They had a house full of books and a father who read them, and a table where the talk ran late into the evening, and the particular kind of comfort that comes not from wealth, but from never once doubting that you are loved. Sir Thomas was a gentleman of the older sort, the sort who believed a man's word was a thing he handed you and could not take back. He managed his land carefully and his money modestly, and he was known across 3 counties as a man whose signature meant exactly what it said. He had a habit of pressing wildflowers between the pages of his books, so that years afterward you might open a volume of poems and find a flattened violet, brown with age, marking a verse he had once wanted to remember. He had a habit of reading aloud in the evenings, and a better habit still of asking his daughter to read instead, because, he said, the words came to life in her mouth in a way they never did in his. That was Eleanor's gift, if you can call a thing a gift, when it has only ever been used inside one house. She read beautifully, not in a performing way, not for show. She read the way water moves, finding the natural shape of a sentence and pouring through it. Her father used to close his eyes when she read and say, when she finished, "There, now I have heard it properly." Remember that, the closing of the eyes. It will matter later. Almost everything in this story will matter later. That is the cruelty and the mercy of how lives are built. We never know, in the moment, which small thing we are doing for the last time, and which small thing is being stored away by fate to be used against us, or for us, years down a road we cannot yet see. There was a younger sister too, Clara, 10 years behind Eleanor, a bright and breakable little thing with their mother's fair hair. Their mother had died bringing Clara into the world, and so in many ways Eleanor had raised the child, and the two of them were bound by something deeper than the ordinary cord of sisters. When you understand that Eleanor would have walked into fire for Clara, you will understand a great deal of what she later did. A woman with someone to protect is the most dangerous and the most vulnerable creature in the world, often in the same breath. Now, into this good and ordinary life there came, some 6 years before our story truly begins, a friendship. And it is on the back of that friendship that everything else is going to break. So attend closely. Sir Thomas Hartley, modest country gentleman, became the trusted friend and unofficial man of business to a young nobleman newly come into one of the oldest dukedoms in England. The young man was Adrian Devereux, the 7th Duke of Ashbourne, and he had inherited his title at 23, far too young, after his father and elder brother both died inside a single hard winter. He came into more land than a man can ride across in a day, more money than he could count, more power than was good for any human soul to hold at that age, and not one single person in all the world who loved him for himself rather than for what he could give them. Picture him, tall, dark-haired, with a sharp, clean jaw and grey eyes that took the measure of a room before he had finished crossing the threshold. He had learned early, the way men in his position learn, that everyone who smiled at him wanted something, and so he stopped trusting smiles. He grew careful. He grew cold. By the time he was 30, he was known across London as a man you did not cross, a man whose disfavour could close every door in the city against you, a man who had ruined more than one family that had thought itself untouchable. They called him, behind their fans and their newspapers, the most feared duke in England, and they were not entirely wrong to. But that came later, and that hardness was not yet fully formed in those early years when he and Sir Thomas Hartley sat across from each other over the Ashbourne accounts, because the young Duke had found, in the quiet country gentleman, the one thing his rank had never permitted him, a friend who wanted nothing. Sir Thomas did not flatter him. Sir Thomas told him the truth about his finances, about his tenants, about himself, plainly and without fear, and the young dukes, starved for it, came to depend on that plain truth the way a man lost in fog comes, to depend on the one light he can see. He dined at Renfield. He sat at the Hartley table while Eleanor read aloud, and though he and the daughter of the house exchanged perhaps a dozen sentences in all those years, he carried something away from that house that he could not name. He had heard, in that warm room, what an evening sounded like when the people in it were not afraid of one another. You see what fate is doing. You see the threads being laid down side by side, the ruined woman and the powerful man, already connected by 100 filaments neither of them is paying attention to. Hold that. We will pull those threads tight soon enough. And now the steward. Every house of that size has one, the man who handles the daily machinery of a great estate, and the Ashbourne steward was a person named Silas Crane. He had been with the family for years. He was correct in his manners, and tireless in his work, and utterly invisible in the way that the most dangerous men often are. And he had one consuming hunger that no one had ever bothered to notice, which was that he believed himself owed. owed more than his wage, owed more than his station, owed by a world that had set men like Adrian Devereux above men like Silas Crane, for no reason he could see except the accent of birth. A man who believes himself owed will, given enough time and enough access to other people's money, find a way to collect. But Crane was not the architect. I want you to remember that too, because the truth of this story is layered, like an onion, like a wound, and we are going to peel it slowly. Crane was an instrument. The hand that truly moved against the Hartleys belonged to someone closer to the Duke than any steward, someone with a name that opened doors, someone with a great deal to lose if a clear-eyed country gentleman kept whispering plain truths into the Duke's ear. But I am getting ahead of myself again. The peeling has its own pace. Here is what the world saw in the year that the Hartleys fell. One grey morning, Silas Crane came to the Duke of Ashbourne with a leather case of documents, and his face was the face of a man bringing bad news that pains him to bring. He laid the documents out on the great desk, one by one, and he explained, in his correct and sorrowful voice, what they showed. They showed that Sir Thomas Hartley, trusted friend, the one honest man, the plain light in the fog, had for 3 years been quietly diverting Ashbourne money into his own accounts. The documents were detailed. There were signatures. There were dates and sums, and a paper trail that led, step by careful step, from the Duke's coffers into the pockets of the man he had loved like a father. I want you to sit with the Duke of Ashbourne for one moment, because cruelty and grief are often the same animal wearing different coats. Adrian Devereux looked at those papers, and he felt the floor of his life give way. The one man he had trusted, the one friend who wanted nothing. And here was the proof, in black ink, that the wanting nothing had been the longest and most patient theft of all. He did not weep. Men like him have unlearned weeping by 30. What he did was far colder. He went still, the way a frozen pond goes still, and underneath the stillness, everything he had ever felt about Sir Thomas Hartley turned hard and sharp and lethal. And then the most feared Duke in England did what he had taught the world to expect of him. He destroyed the man. He did it thoroughly. He did it publicly. He withdrew his backing from every venture Sir Thomas had a hand in. He let it be known, in the quiet, poisonous way these things are let known, that Hartley was not to be trusted with a shilling. The accusation was never even brought before a magistrate, because it did not need to be. A word from a duke is worth more than a verdict. Within a season, the friends fell away, the credit dried up, the invitations stopped. Within a year, Renfield itself was gone, sold to cover debts that had been called in all at once by creditors who had read the wind. And Sir Thomas Hartley, who had handed the world his honest word for 60 years and watched it count for nothing against a steward's leather case, took to his bed in a rented room in a town where no one knew him, and turned his face to the wall and did not get up again. The physicians called it a failure of the heart. Eleanor, who sat with him at the end, knew it was not his heart that had failed, it was his faith. A man can survive almost anything except the discovery that being good was not enough. He never knew it was a lie. That is the part I find hardest to carry, and I have carried a great many stories. He died believing the world had simply decided he was a thief, and that there was no proof he could offer against the certainty of a duke, and he died ashamed. Eleanor held his hand and told him she knew he was innocent, and he looked at her with such gratitude and such defeat, and he said, "You must do better than I did, my girl. You must not let them make you small." And then he was gone, and she was 19 years old, with a 10-year-old sister and a ruined name, and not one friend left in all the world who would say the word Hartley above a whisper. That is where she began, the woman in the dark study. Not at the top, looking down, at the very bottom, looking up at a long, cold cliff. I told you she would start in a vulnerable place. I did not tell you how far she would have to climb. The 5 years that followed were the kind of years that do not make a story, only an endurance. She sold what little had not been seized, her mother's small jewellery, her own few good gowns, and she placed Clara in a charity school for the daughters of distressed gentlefolk, a grim and well-meaning place that took the girl for the sake of a name they did not know was disgraced, and that would keep her only so long as the modest fees kept arriving. And then Eleanor went out to earn those fees, the only way a gently raised woman without a name could earn anything in that age. She went into service of the soft kind, as a companion, a lady's reader, a hired voice for the elderly and the lonely and the half-blind. She became, by careful design, Miss Eliza Gray. Gray because it was the colour of being unnoticed, and being unnoticed was the only safety she had left. She invented a modest history for Miss Gray, a clergyman's orphaned daughter, respectable, dull, forgettable. She learned to keep her eyes down and her voice low. She learned to be furniture. The girl who had once made words come alive at her father's table spent 5 years making herself as flat and grey and silent as her false name. But she never stopped. Underneath the flatness, underneath the greyness, Eleanor Hartley was doing one thing with absolute and patient ferocity. She was looking for proof. She knew her father was innocent. She knew there had been documents. And she knew, because she had made it her business over 5 years to know, that the original papers in the Hartley affair had never been destroyed. They had been kept. They were somewhere in the possession of the Duke of Ashbourne, locked away with all the other dead business of his estate, because powerful men keep everything the way dragons keep gold, out of an instinct they themselves do not examine. If she could find those papers, if she could get her hands on the originals and prove they were forged, she could clear her father's name. She could lift the word thief off his gravestone. She could give Clara back a name the girl could say aloud. It was, by any sane measure, an impossible ambition for a hired reader with no name and no money and no friends. And then, in the 5th year, fate did what fate does, which is to hand you exactly what you have prayed for, wrapped in exactly the thing you most fear. She heard, through the small underground network of servants and agencies and quiet recommendations that moved gentlewomen from post to post, that the Duke of Ashbourne required a reader. Not a companion, not a nurse. A reader. Because the most feared duke in England had, 2 years before, gone blind. I will tell you how, because it tells you who he had become and who he had always secretly been underneath the cold. It was a fire, a wing of Ashbourne Hall caught in the night, a fallen lamp, a dry season, the usual small accidents that bring down great houses. And in the smoke and the chaos, a young housemaid was trapped on an upper floor, and every man in that household stood in the courtyard and looked up at the flames, and did the arithmetic that men do, and found her not worth the cost. And the Duke of Ashbourne, the cold man, the cruel man, the man who had broken Sir Thomas Hartley without lifting his voice, went back in. He went up through the smoke, and he found the girl, and he brought her down, and he did it with his own hands and his own breath, and the breath was the price. The smoke took something in his eyes that the physicians could not name and could not mend, and over the 18 months that followed, his sight failed, slowly, like a lamp running out of oil, until there was nothing left but light and shadow. And then, not even that. By the time Eleanor heard of the post, the Duke of Ashbourne lived in a darkness as complete as the one he had cast Sir Thomas Hartley into. I will let you decide whether that is justice or merely symmetry. I have never been sure there is a difference. You can imagine the war that went on inside Eleanor when she heard. Here was her chance, the only chance she would ever get, to enter the one house in England that held the proof of her father's innocence. And it belonged to the man who had killed him. To take the post, she would have to walk every day into the presence of her family's destroyer, sit close to him, read to him, serve him, smile at him, and never once let him hear in her voice the thing that lived in her heart, which was a hatred so old and so cold it had become a kind of stone she carried in her chest. She told herself she could do it. She told herself the blindness made it possible, that a man who could not see her face could never connect plain Miss Grey to the daughter of the man he had ruined, a daughter he had in any case barely glanced at across a dinner table years before. She told herself it was only a matter of months. Find the papers. Take what she came for. Vanish. He would never know. She did not let herself think, in those first, calculating weeks, about the part of the plan that had no plan, which was what it would do to a person to sit night after night beside the author of her grief and read to him, and slowly, terribly, begin to learn him as a human being rather than a monster. She did not think about that, because if she had thought about it, she might not have gone. And then there would be no story. So she went. The carriage that the agency arranged set her down at Ashbourne Hall on a grey afternoon in late autumn, and she stood for a moment in the great gravel courtyard and looked up at the house that her father's destroyer had built his silence in. Half of it was new, she saw. The wing that had burned, rebuilt in paler stone that had not yet weathered to match the rest. The whole place had the particular quality of enormous wealth that has stopped caring whether anyone admires it. She gripped her small case in both hands. She had 31 shillings to her name, and a sister whose fees were due in 6 weeks, and a false name pinned over her real one like a paper mask. And she walked up the steps of the house she had come to rob, and she rang the bell. The housekeeper who received her was a Mrs. Pruitt, a broad and watchful woman of perhaps 60, who had clearly run the household through the fire and the darkness and the slow ruin of its master's temper, and who measured the new reader with the frank, assessing stare of a woman who had seen a great many hopefuls come and go. "You'll not last a fortnight," she said, not unkindly, as she led Eleanor up the great staircase. The last 3 did not. "His Grace is—" She searched for a word that would not be disloyal. "Particular. He cannot abide a reader who performs. He cannot abide pity. And he hears everything, Miss Grey. Everything. A man who has lost his eyes does not lose anything else. He gains. Mind that you remember it." Eleanor said that she would. She did not yet know how completely true it was, or how badly it would one day catch her. They came to the door of the library, and Mrs. Pruitt knocked once and opened it without waiting, and Eleanor stepped into the room where she would either save her father or lose herself, and quite possibly both. It was a magnificent room, 2 stories of books rising into shadow, with a great hearth at one end and tall windows along one wall, and the late grey light came through the windows and fell across the figure in the chair by the fire, and Eleanor saw the Duke of Ashbourne for the first time in 5 years. He had changed. Of course he had changed. The cold, sharp, handsome young man she remembered from the edges of her father's dinners had become something both diminished and intensified, the way fire both consumes a thing and reveals its true shape. He was thinner. There was grey now at his temples, though he could not have been much past 35. He sat very upright, very still, with a stillness that she would come to understand was not peace, but vigilance, the held breath of a man who has lost the sense that warns of approach and must compensate with every other. His eyes were open. That was the thing that undid her composure in the first instant. that his eyes were open and grey and turned toward the door, and looked almost as though they saw her, and did not. He wore a frock coat of deep wine-dark red, and his hands rested on the arms of the chair, long-fingered, still. "You are not Mrs. Pruitt," he said. His voice was lower than she remembered, roughened, she would later learn, by the smoke that had taken his sight. "Mrs. Pruitt walks as though she is putting the floor in its place. You walk as though you are apologizing to it. You are the new reader." "I am, Your Grace," said Eleanor, and she was proud, even in that terror, of how steady the lie came out. "Eliza Gray." He was silent for a moment. He had a way of being silent that was not absence, but the most intense kind of attention, and she felt it move over her like a hand in the dark, taking the measure of everything about her that was not her face. "Gray," he repeated. "Come closer, Miss Gray. I do not bite, whatever they have told you in the servants' hall. Sit there, where the light is, so that you may read. I cannot use the light any longer, but I am told it comforts those who can, and I have not yet grown so far from the world as to deny a person a window." It was, she thought, almost kind. It threw her badly. She had armoured herself against a monster, and the monster had offered her the chair by the window. She sat. He told her to choose a book from the third shelf on the left. Any book, he did not care which, only that she begin, because the silence of the house in the afternoons had become a thing he could no longer bear. And Eleanor Hartley walked to the shelf in her dead enemy's library and reached up and took down a book at random and opened it and began the long deception that would unmake them both. I want to tell you about those first weeks, honestly, because the honest thing is also the strange thing. She had braced herself to play a part for a few short weeks and then disappear. She had not braced herself for the part to become difficult in the way it became difficult, which was not that he was cruel, though he could be sharp, but that he was lonely in a way she recognized, because it was the loneliness of a person who has lost the world that knew them. They fell into a rhythm. Mornings she had to herself, and she spent them, when she dared, drifting through the parts of the great house she was permitted, mapping it, learning where the locked rooms were, learning which doors had keys and which keys hung where, hunting for the place a careful man would keep the dead business of his estate. Afternoons and evenings she read to him. They began with the dry things, histories and treatises, the kind of reading a man requests when he is testing whether you will bore him. She did not bore him. She read the dullest parliamentary history as though it mattered, because she had learned long ago at her father's table that everything matters if you read it as though it does. And somewhere in the second week, she looked up from a paragraph about grain tariffs and found that he had closed his eyes. The closing of the eyes. "I told you it would matter." He did it without thinking, the way a man does a thing he has done for years, and she understood with a small, cold shock that the gesture meant the same for him as it had for her father. Now I have heard it properly. And something in her that she had nailed, shut 5 years before, gave one quiet creak. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself a great many things in those weeks that meant nothing. He was not a comfortable man to read to. He interrupted. He argued with the books. He had opinions about everything, and a memory like a steel trap. And woe to the author who contradicted himself between one chapter and the next, because the Duke of Ashbourne would catch it 300 pages on and demand she find the earlier passage and read it again so that he could be properly disgusted. But the arguing, Eleanor slowly realized, was the most alive thing about him. In the daylight, when his secretary came, when his man of business came, when his cousin came, the Duke was a closed door, courteous and cold, and giving nothing. In the evenings, arguing with a dead historian through the medium of a hired woman's voice, he was almost happy, and he did not know it, and she did, and the knowing was its own slow poison. The cousin. I must give you the cousin, because the cousin is the hand we have not yet seen, and the cousin is going to try to kill them both before we are done. His name was Roderick Devereux, and he was the Duke's heir presumptive, the man who would inherit Ashbourne and all its lands and its great cold power if Adrian died without a son, which, given that the Duke was blind and unmarried, and showed no sign of correcting either condition, Roderick had every reason to expect. He came to the hall often, on the pretext of helping his afflicted cousin manage affairs that a blind man surely could not manage alone, and he was charming in the oily way of a man who has decided in advance to be charming, and Eleanor disliked him on sight with an instinct she did not at first understand, and later understood all too well. Because here is the buried thing, the thing at the very bottom of the wound, and I am going to tell you now, even though Eleanor did not learn it until much later, because you have been patient, and you have earned the shape of it. Silas Crane, the steward who brought the forged documents that destroyed Sir Thomas Hartley. Silas Crane had not acted alone, and he had not acted for himself. He had acted for Roderick Devereux. Because 6 years ago, when the young Duke had begun to lean on the honest country gentleman's plain advice, Roderick had seen his comfortable expectations begin to wobble. An honest man at the Duke's right hand was examining the Ashbourne accounts, and the Ashbourne accounts, examined honestly, would eventually have revealed that the heir presumptive had for years been quietly bleeding the estate he expected to inherit, borrowing against it, falsifying against it, treating it as the bank of a future already his. Sir Thomas Hartley, plain and honest and trusted, was 3 months of careful auditing away from finding it. So Roderick reached the steward, who believed himself owed, and between them they did the oldest trick in the world. They took the crime that one of them had committed, and they painted it onto the one man whose ruin would solve all their problems at once. They forged the Hartley papers, they fed them to the Duke, and they watched the most feared man in England destroy the only honest friend he had ever had. And they smiled, and they were safe. That is the truth Eleanor was sitting 12 feet from every evening, reading grain tariffs aloud to the one man who had been as deceived as her father, though neither of them yet knew it. The Duke believed Hartley a thief. Eleanor believed the Duke a murderer. And the real murderer sat at their dinner table whenever he pleased, in beautiful clothes, calling the Duke cousin and waiting for him to die. I told you we would peel it slowly. There is more skin to come. Now. The night everything began to turn. It was perhaps 2 months into her time at the Hall, deep in a cold December, and Eleanor had grown bold, or perhaps merely desperate, because Clara's fees were due again, and the search for the papers had turned up nothing in 2 months of careful hunting, and she was beginning to fear she had wagered everything on a room that did not exist. That evening, the Duke was tired and dismissed her early, and rather than go up to her cold little room, she lingered, and she did a thing she had not yet dared. There was a small private study off the library, a room she had never been admitted to, and that evening she had seen, for the first time, where the key to it hung. She waited until the house was asleep, and then she took the key, and she let herself into the Duke's private study by the light of a single candle, and she began to search for the proof that would clear her father's name. It did not take her as long as she had feared. Powerful men are orderly about their dead business. In a tall cabinet, locked, but locked with a key that hung on the same ring as the door, she found the estate's old papers, filed by year and by matter, and among them, In a folder gone soft at the edges with handling, she found a label in a clerk's neat hand that read simply, Hartley. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely lift it out. She set it on the desk. She opened it. And there they were. The documents that had killed her father, the famous proofs, the signatures, and the sums. She made herself read them with a clear, cold eye, because she had not come this far to faint at the sight of the weapon. And reading them, she saw at once what her father, dead and disgraced, had never been given the chance to see. They were forgeries, good ones, but forgeries. The signatures were her father's hand, counterfeited by someone who had studied it well, but had not understood it. For Sir Thomas had a particular way of forming a capital H, a small loop where the world made a line, a thing his daughter had watched him do 10,000 times and would have known in her sleep. The forger had made it a line. Every signature, a line. Her father had not signed a single one of these papers, and Eleanor Hartley, standing in her enemy's study at midnight, finally held in her two hands the proof that he was innocent. She wept then, quietly, fiercely, with her hand pressed over her mouth. 5 years of grief breaking in a room she was not supposed to be in. And when she was done weeping, she did a strange thing, a thing she only half understood. She did not take the papers and run. She had planned to take them and run. Instead, she sat down in her enemy's chair and she kept looking through the folder, because something at the bottom of it had caught the edge of her candle, a paper of a different kind, newer, and her father's name was on it too. It was a letter. It was in the Duke's own hand. She did not know that yet, but she would learn. And it was addressed to no one or to itself, the way a man writes when he is trying to think with a pen. And it was, dated not 5 years before, in the time of the ruin, but a little over a year past. Eleanor read it by her one small flame, and as she read it, the whole architecture of her hatred began, very slowly, to come apart. It was an account of a doubt. The Duke had written it to himself, the way a careful man lays out a problem he cannot solve. He had written that he had, some 18 months previously, come into knowledge that troubled him concerning the Hartley affair. That a man on his deathbed, Silas Crane, as it happened, dying of a long illness and frightened at the last of what waited for him, had said things, half-mad and feverish things, that the Duke had at first dismissed and then could not stop turning over. That Crane had wept and asked forgiveness and spoken a name, and the name had not been Hartley's. The Duke had written that he had begun, quietly, to re-examine the documents that had condemned his old friend, and that the more he examined them, the colder he grew, because he was a man who had once trusted his own judgment absolutely, and was beginning to suspect that his judgment had been the instrument of a murder. And at the bottom, in a hand pressed so hard the pen had nearly torn the page, he had written, "If it is true, then I did not lose my sight in the fire. I lost it long before, the day I chose to believe the worst of the one man who never lied to me. And I have spent it on a creature who deserved my faith least of any soul alive. I must find the daughter. Whatever it costs, I must find her, and I must make it right, though there is no right large enough. I must find the daughter." Eleanor sat in the dark and held the proof of her father's innocence in one hand and the proof of her enemy's repentance in the other, and she understood that she had walked into a house to take vengeance on a monster, and had found instead a man who had been searching for 2 years for the very woman now sitting in his chair, reading his confession by stolen candlelight. He had been looking for her, and she had walked in the front door under a false name and read him grain tariffs and let him close his eyes and think, now I have heard it properly, and never once given him the chance to know that the daughter he was breaking himself to find was 12 feet away. She did not sleep that night. You will understand why. The whole foundation of 5 years had shifted under her in a single hour, and a person cannot rebuild a self that fast. She put the papers back exactly as she had found them, all of them, including the proof, because she understood now that she did not need to steal it. It would be given. And she locked the cabinet and returned the key. And she went up to her cold room and sat by the window until the grey winter dawn. And she tried to decide who she was, now that she was no longer the woman she had walked in as. And she could not decide. Because the trouble with hatred, the thing no one tells you, is that it is also a kind of company. For 5 years, the stone of it in her chest had kept her warm, had given her something to do, had been the reason she got up in the cold mornings and made herself grey and went out to sell her voice to strangers. If the Duke was not a monster, if he was only a man who had been deceived as cruelly as her father, then her hatred had nowhere to go, and she was simply a tired and lonely woman in a borrowed name with no enemy left to organize her grief around. That is a more frightening thing to lose than you might suppose. She mourned her hatred a little in those grey dawn hours. I do not think she ever told anyone that but me, and I am telling you, because I think you understand it. She told herself she would carry on as before. Read, search no more. There was no more to search for. Gather herself, decide later, slowly, in safety, what to do with everything she now knew. She had the truth. The truth would keep. There was no hurry. There is always a hurry. Fate cannot abide a person who thinks there is time. It was perhaps a fortnight later that the Duke did the thing that broke the deception open, and the terrible part is that he did it in tenderness, with no idea what he held. They had finished a long, dull volume that evening, and he was restless. And he said, "Enough of dead men's opinions, Miss Grey. Choose something for yourself tonight. I have heard you read what I command for 2 months. I should like to hear you read what you would choose. There is a shelf by the south window of things that are not history. Go and find something you love and read me that. I am told a person's choosing tells you more about them than a year of their conversation." It was the first genuinely intimate thing he had ever asked of her, and it frightened her, and she went to the south shelf to escape the look she could not see him giving her. And on the south shelf, among the Duke's books of poetry and travel, and the soft, useless, beautiful reading that a hard man keeps and never admits to, Eleanor Hartley found her father's library. She did not understand at first. She pulled down a slim volume of poems and opened it, and her own father's handwriting looked up at her from the margin. "I told you he kept everything. I told you powerful men keep everything." When Renfield was sold, when the Hartley books went under the auctioneer's hammer with everything else, someone had bought them. A great lot of them. The whole working library of a country gentleman, bought by an agent and shipped to Ashbourne, and shelved in a great house by a south window. And Eleanor had been reading in the same room with them for 2 months, without knowing. She knew now why. The letter had told her. I must find the daughter, whatever it costs. A man who is trying to atone for destroying another man begins by buying back the pieces of him that the world has scattered. The Duke had been gathering up the fragments of Sir Thomas Hartley for over a year. His books, his papers, doubtless his good name, if he could only find the one person to hand it back to. He had filled his library with her father, and then gone blind, and could no longer see a single page of him, and had hired a stranger to read the very books to him without either of them knowing whose they were. I do not know a crueler or a kinder coincidence in any story I have told. Hold it a moment with me. Then we go on, because the Duke was waiting, and he had asked her to read him something she loved. She could not feel her own feet carrying her back to the chair. The book she held was the one her father had loved best, a worn green volume of poems, and the margins were full of him, his small, loyal handwriting, his pressed flowers, a faded violet still flat against a verse he had wanted to remember. She should have put it back. She should have taken anything else. But she could not make her hands obey, because the dead are so quiet. And here was her father's voice on the page after 5 years of silence, and she was starved for it, the way the Duke had once been starved for an honest evening, and she sat down in the chair by the window with her father's book open in her lap, and she began to read the verse he had marked. And her voice did not finish it. It broke. 3 lines in, on the exact word her father used to pause before because he loved it, her voice closed like a fist, and she sat there with the tears running silently down her face and the marked verse swimming in front of her, unable to make a sound. And in the great chair by the fire, the Duke of Ashbourne, who could not see her tears, but who heard everything, sat up very slowly and turned his sightless grey eyes toward her, and the whole quality of his stillness changed. "Read me that line again, Miss Grey," he said softly, "the one your voice will not finish. And we are back at the beginning. You see? You have been here before. We have come all the way around to the dark study and the broken voice and the open book, except now you understand what it costs, and that is the only kind of beginning worth coming back to." She did not read it again. She could not. And the Duke rose from his chair, and a blind man rising in his own room moves with a fearful certainty, because he has counted every step 1,000 times. And he crossed to her, and he stood over her, close, and she could have run, and she did not run. And he said, in that low voice gone strange and urgent, "I have heard that catch before, in that exact place, on that exact word." He was not speaking to her now, not quite. He was speaking to a memory, hunting it through the dark the way he hunted everything now, by sound. A long time ago, in a warm room, in a good house, before everything went wrong with the world, a young woman read aloud, and the whole room went quiet to listen, and her father closed his eyes. And she always caught on that word. Her father used to laugh and say she had been catching on it since she was a child, because she loved it too well to say it smoothly. His hand came up, slowly, and found the back of the chair beside her face, gripping it. I told myself I imagined it, the voice. These 2 months I have told myself a hired stranger could not possibly, that grief makes a man hear the dead in every... He stopped. His breath was unsteady. "Tell me your name," he said. "Your true one. I am asking you in my own house, in the dark we share, and I am asking you as a man who has done a terrible thing and has been trying for 2 years to find the one person he most wronged so that he might at least know her face, which God has now seen fit to forbid me forever. So I cannot know your face. But I can know your name. Tell me your name." And Eleanor Hartley, who had come to that house to take a thing in secret and slip away, stood up out of the chair, so that she was close enough to feel the warmth coming off him, and she made the choice her father had begged her to make on his deathbed, the choice not to be made small, and she said, "My name is Eleanor Hartley. I am the daughter of Sir Thomas Hartley, the man you ruined. I came into your house under a false name to find the proof that he was innocent, and I found it 3 weeks ago in your private study, in the folder marked with his name. And I found something else in that folder, Your Grace. I found your letter. I know that you know. I have known for 3 weeks that we have both been mourning the same murdered man. And the most feared duke in England put his hand over his mouth like a child and made a sound that I will not try to describe to you, because some sounds are not for retelling, and he sank down onto the floor of his own library at the feet of the woman he had spent 2 years and a great fortune trying to find. And he wept the tears he had unlearned at 30. And Eleanor Hartley stood over him with her father's book in her hand and her father's enemy at her feet, holding all the power in the room, every last grain of it, and discovered that having it felt nothing at all like she had spent 5 years imagining it would. This is the part everyone gets wrong, in stories and in life both. We imagine the moment of triumph as a clean, bright thing, the villain on the floor, the wronged one standing tall, and it can be that, for a heartbeat. But Eleanor looked down at the broken man who had broken her family, and she did not feel triumph. She felt the terrible loneliness of a person who has finally arrived at the place she walked 5 cold years to reach and found it empty of the thing she came for, because the thing she came for was her father, alive, and no amount of any duke's tears was ever going to give her that. The proof would clear his name. It would not unbury him. She understood, standing there, the difference between justice and resurrection, and she understood that she had only ever been able to have the smaller of the two. "Get up," she said at last. Not gently, not cruelly, just true. "Get up, Your Grace. Weeping at my feet costs you nothing and gives me nothing. If you are sorry, there are only 2 things I want from you, and tears are neither of them." He got up. He was good at being told the truth. He had built half his earlier life on Sir Thomas's plain truths and starved for them ever since. He stood, and he steadied himself, and he said, in a voice scraped raw, "Name them." "I want my father's name cleared," she said, "publicly, completely, by you. The same mouth that called him a thief in front of all of London is going to call him an innocent man in front of all of London, and it is going to name the forgery for what it was. And it is going to do it whatever it costs you, because you wrote those words yourself in that letter, whatever it costs. And now I am holding you to them." She drew a breath. "And I want my sister kept. She is 15. She is in a charity school under a name she does not know is disgraced, and the fees are nearly due, and she is the last Hartley besides me, and she is going to have a future, and you are going to make certain of it. Those are my terms. Clear his name, and keep my sister. Do that, and we are quits, and I will walk out of your house, and you will never hear my voice again." It was a fair price. It was, if anything, a low one. She could have asked for far more, and a cleverer or a colder woman would have. But the Duke heard the part she did not say, the part underneath the terms, that she meant to leave, that the price of his atonement was that she would take her father's voice out of his dark house forever, and he would go back to the silence he had hired strangers to fill. And he said very quietly, "And if I should wish to offer more than your terms?" "You may not," she said. "Atonement is not a door into my regard, Your Grace. It is only the closing of a debt. I will not be bought twice." But her own voice caught when she said it, on a different word this time, and they both heard it, because he heard everything, and she knew that he had heard it. And she turned and left the room before he could say the thing that was forming in the dark behind his sightless eyes. That should have been the end. Justice arranged, terms agreed, the wronged woman departing with her father's honour in her hands. If the world were only made of 2 people, and their old grief, it would have been the end. But I told you, there was a hand we had not yet seen, and the hand chose that exact week to close. Roderick Devereux had grown nervous. He had been growing nervous for over a year. ever since the dying steward had babbled his deathbed terrors, ever since the Duke had gone quiet and grim and started asking the old questions about the Hartley accounts. A blind cousin who could not manage his own affairs was a comfortable thing for an heir. A blind cousin who had begun, quietly, to re-examine the very crime that protected the heir was a knife pointed at Roderick's throat. And now there was a reader in the house, a woman Roderick could not place and did not like, who had been alone with his cousin every evening for 2 months, and the Duke had changed, had grown, in the last weeks, almost alive again, had sent Roderick away twice with sharp, short words, where before he had been merely cold. Roderick, who had a criminal's instinct for the moment the ground shifts, smelled something, and being the kind of man he was, he did not wait to learn what it was. He moved first. He moved the only way a man in his position could move against a duke. He could not openly fight a man of Ashbourne's rank, so he went to undermine the rank itself. He began, in the right ears, in the clubs and the drawing-rooms, to plant the gentlest, most reasonable, most poisonous of doubts. That the poor Duke of Ashbourne, blind these 2 years, grieving and isolated, had perhaps begun to fail in his mind as well as his eyes. That he had taken strange notions, that he spoke of crimes long settled and dead men long buried, of forgeries and false accusations, and had become fixed and feverish on the idea that he had wronged some country gentleman years ago. A sure sign, was it not, of an unsound mind, this need to manufacture guilt out of dead business? That it might soon be a kindness and a duty for the family to take the management of the Ashbourne estate gently into more capable hands. His own, of course, as heir. For the Duke's own good. You see the trap. If the Duke ever did stand up in public and declare that he had ruined an innocent man on forged evidence, Roderick had already arranged for the whole world to hear it as the raving of a broken mind. He would clear Sir Thomas Hartley and be declared mad in the same breath, and Roderick would inherit everything in all but name, and the truth would die a second time. Eleanor learned of it because Mrs. Pruitt, who missed nothing and had decided over 2 months that she liked the grey, quiet reader who made the master close his eyes, came to her room one morning with a face like a thundercloud and told her what was being said below stairs, where the servants of the visiting gentry talked, and what Mr. Roderick was about. "He means to have him declared not in his right mind," the housekeeper said grimly. "I've seen it done to old Lord Marbury 3 years past, by a nephew that couldn't wait. Once the word's out, it can't be called back. And the master's that proud, he'll not lower himself to argue he's sane. He'll go all the colder and the stiffer, which is exactly the thing they'll point to. He'll hand them the rope himself." She looked at Eleanor with a sudden sharp suspicion of how much this grey reader cared, and how much she seemed already to know. "You'd best tell me, miss, whatever it is you're not telling. Because I think there's a deal more to you than Eliza Gray, and I think the master's going to need every soul in this house that's loyal to him before the month is out." And Eleanor made a second choice. She had made the first when she gave him her name. The second was larger. She could still walk away. She had his promise. She could take her father's name and her sister's future and go, and let Roderick and Adrian Devereux tear each other apart over a dukedom. And what was that to her? The Duke was nothing to her. She had told him so. Atonement is only the closing of a debt. But she did not walk away. And the reason she did not is the reason this is a story worth telling, and not merely a grievance worth settling. She did not walk away because somewhere in 2 months of grain tariffs and closed eyes and a blind man's terrible attention, the stone in her chest had quietly turned into something else, something she had not asked for and did not want and could not now put down. and because she understood that if Roderick succeeded, then her father's name would never be cleared. For who believes a madman's confession? And the only thing that could prove the Duke sane was the very proof that proved her father innocent. Their two fates, the ruined gentleman's daughter and the man who ruined him, had been forged into a single chain. To save her father, she had to save his murderer. Fate has a sense of humour, and it is not always a kind one. So she went down into the library, and she found the Duke, and she told him everything Mrs. Pruitt had told her, plainly, the way her father would have. And then she told him what they were going to do about it, because she had thought it through on the stairs, and she had her father's head for a problem laid out clean. "You will not stand up and confess," she said. "Not yet. That is the rope, and Roderick has greased it. If you proclaim a forgery on your own word alone, you are a blind, grieving madman inventing crimes. So we will not give him your word. We will give him proof, in a form that cannot be called the fancy of an unsound mind. The original documents are forgeries. I have seen the signatures, and so can anyone with eyes, because the forger did not understand my father's hand. We bring in men who cannot be doubted, a magistrate, a queen's man, a writing master who will swear to the counterfeit, and we lay the genuine and the forged side by side before witnesses too many and too respectable to suppress, and we let the documents speak so that no one need rely on the word of a man whose mind is in question. And we do it before Roderick can act, not after. We move first." She paused. "And there is one thing more, Your Grace, and it is the heart of it. Silas Crane did not forge those papers for himself. A steward gains nothing by ruining his master's friend. He did it for someone who gained everything. Someone whose secret my father was 3 months from uncovering when he died. Someone who has spent the last year terrified that you were beginning to see it." She let that sit in the dark between them. "You wrote in your letter that Crane spoke a name at the end. You did not write the name, but you know it. Say it now." And the Duke of Ashbourne, very slowly, in a voice that had gone to ash, said the name. Roderick. He had known for a year. He had not been able to bear it. That the rot was not in a dead steward, but in his own living blood. In the cousin who sat at his table. In the family that was all he had left. He had hidden the name even from his own written confession, because to write it was to be truly alone in the world. It was Roderick. Crane was his creature. The money he stole for Roderick's debts, and when your father came too close to the books, Roderick had Crane turn the theft into a forgery and paint it onto the only honest man in my employ. I have known for a year, Miss Hartley, and I have done nothing, because doing something meant admitting that everyone I have ever trusted has used me, and that the one man I should have trusted, I killed. His sightless eyes were wet. You ask me to move against my own heir with the proof that damns me at the very centre of it. You ask me to clear your father by destroying my family and confessing my own crime in the same hour. Yes, said Eleanor, I do. Because it is true, and because it is the only thing that saves either of us, and because my father once told me that the right choice is almost always the frightening one, and he died for believing it, and I am not going to let his daughter believe anything smaller. She knelt down then, in front of his chair, so that her voice would come to him from where his hands rested, and she took his hand, the first time she had touched him, and she said, I came into this house to take something from you. I am going to leave it having given you something instead, if you will let me. I am going to give you back the chance to be the man my father thought you were, before they made you believe you were a fool for it. Stand with me, Adrian. Move first, and whatever it costs. He turned his hand over under hers, and his fingers closed around hers, deliberate and certain, the grip of a man who has made a decision and means it. "Whatever it costs," he said. "I will not draw out the doing of it, because the doing of a thing well planned is rarely as dramatic as the deciding, and you and I have been through a great deal together tonight, and you deserve to see the wheel come round." They moved fast, faster than Roderick believed a blind man and a hired reader could move. The Duke had more friends than his coldness suggested. He had simply stopped calling on them in his darkness. And Eleanor learned in those frantic days that the most feared Duke in England had, buried under all that ice, a core of iron that could be magnificent when it was finally pointed in a true direction. He summoned a magistrate he had known since boyhood, a man entirely beyond Roderick's reach. He summoned a master of handwriting from the city, the most respected in England, a man whose word in a court was very nearly law. He summoned 2 bishops and an earl and the Duke's own ancient solicitor, witnesses too weighty for any whisper of madness to move. And he did it all in the space of 4 days, under Roderick's very nose, by means of letters that Eleanor wrote at his dictation and sent out through Mrs. Pruitt's loyal hands. And on a cold, bright morning in the great hall of Ashbourne, before that gathering of unimpeachable men, the Duke of Ashbourne had the genuine and the forged documents laid side by side upon a long table, and he had the writing master examine them in front of every witness, and the writing master, who had been told nothing of what he would find, the better that his judgment be clean, looked through his glass at the signatures and grew very grave, and said that he had been 40 years at his trade, and had rarely seen a counterfeit so confident and so wrong, and that the man who signed the genuine papers and the man whose name was forged on the false ones were as different as 2 hands could be, and that he would swear to it before any court in the land. And then, and only then, with the proof established by a mouth that no one could call mad, did the Duke of Ashbourne rise and address the men he had gathered, and say, in a clear, cold, steady voice, that 5 years before he had been deceived by his own steward and his own kinsman into believing a good man a thief, and that he had ruined that good man on forged evidence, and that the good man's name was Sir Thomas Hartley, and that he, Adrian Devereux, Duke of Ashbourne, declared him before God and these witnesses to be wholly innocent, and a better man than the one who had wronged him. He named the forgery. He named the dead steward. And then, in the silence, with his blind eyes turned toward the place where his cousin stood, he named Roderick. Roderick had come to the hall expecting, I think, to begin his own quiet campaign that very day, to murmur to the bishops about his poor cousin's failing mind. He had not expected to walk into a room where the proof was already laid out, the witnesses already weighed, the writing master already sworn. He tried, even then. He was a clever man, and clever men fight to the last inch. He laughed lightly and turned to the magistrate and began to say what a sorrow it was to see his cousin so far gone in his affliction as to invent. And the magistrate, who had examined the documents with his own eyes, cut him off cold and said that the documents were not an invention, and that he would thank Mr. Devereux to explain, before these witnesses, how his late steward had come to forge signatures in the service of debts that the magistrate's own clerks had, in the last 4 days, traced quite clearly to Mr. Devereux's account, because Eleanor had thought of that too. She had had the Duke's solicitor pull Roderick's debts into the light alongside everything else, the long, quiet bleeding of the estate, the borrowing against an inheritance not yet his. It was all there. It had always been there, waiting, the way her father had said it was waiting 5 years before, 3 months from being found. The reversal, when it came, was total, and it was quiet, because the truly final defeats usually are. There was no shouting. There was a clever man standing in a great cold hall, watching every face in it turn to stone against him, understanding in real time that the trap he had spent a year building for another man had closed on himself, that the blind cousin he had counted on to fail had seen more clearly than any of them, guided by the one voice Roderick had been too arrogant to fear, a grey, hired woman he had not troubled to learn the name of. He had been undone by the daughter of the man he murdered, working in his cousin's house under a false name, and he had walked past her a dozen times and never once looked at her, because she had made herself invisible. And invisibility, it turns out, is a kind of power that powerful men never see coming. He left England before the month was out, ahead of the writ. He did not inherit. He did not return. His name, where it is mentioned at all now, is mentioned the way you mention a draught that came in under a door and put out the candles. And Sir Thomas Hartley's name was cleared, publicly, completely. The same circles that had whispered thief now spoke of the cruel forgery that had destroyed an innocent gentleman, and society, which loves nothing so much as a story of restored virtue once the restoring is safely done, took up his memory and praised it, and a notice was printed, and the word came off the gravestone at last. Eleanor went alone to the small churchyard where they had buried him in disgrace, and she knelt in the cold grass, and she told him. She told him everything. She told him she had not let them make her small. And whatever you believe about whether the dead can hear us, I have my own opinions, and I keep them. I will tell you that she came away from that grave lighter than she had been in 5 years, as though she had finally set down a thing she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was not part of her own body. Clara was taken from the charity school and given a future, a real one, the kind her name and her father's restored honour now entitled her to, the kind Eleanor had bled 5 grey years to buy her a corner of. That was the Duke's doing, freely, and Eleanor let him do it, because it was for Clara and not for herself, and she had drawn that line very clearly, and the Duke, who heard everything, had heard it and respected it. He restored to the Hartley sisters what could be restored of their father's fortune, which was a great deal, since most of it had been stolen rather than spent, and the stealing was now a matter of record. He would have given them Renfield itself, but it had passed through 2 owners and could not easily be had, and Eleanor said it did not matter, and meant it, because a house is only walls, and the thing that had made Renfield a home had died in a rented room 5 years before and could not be bought back at any price. So, the terms were met. The debt was closed. Justice, the smaller of the 2 things a person can want, had been done as fully as the living can do it for the dead. And by every law of the bargain Eleanor had struck in the dark library, she was now free to go, and to take her voice out of the Duke's house forever, exactly as she had said she would. She packed her small case. It was the same case she had carried in 3 months before, but everything inside it had changed, because Eliza Gray did not exist anymore. It was Eleanor Hartley's case now, and Eleanor Hartley had a name she could say aloud, and a sister with a future and money enough to never again be furniture in a stranger's house. She had won. She had won everything she came for. She stood in her little room with the case packed and the door open and the whole free world in front of her, and she found that she could not make her feet carry her down the stairs, and she stood there a long time trying to understand why, the way you stand at the top of your own stairs sometimes, having forgotten what you came up for. And then she understood why, and the understanding frightened her more than Roderick ever had, more than the Duke had on that first grey afternoon. She did not want to go. She went down to the library one last time to say it, because she was her father's daughter, and her father did not leave a true thing unsaid out of cowardice. The Duke was in his chair by the fire, very still, in his wine-dark coat, and he must have heard her come in. He heard everything. But he did not turn, and she understood that he was holding himself still on purpose, the way a man holds still when a wild thing he loves has come close, and he is afraid that any movement will send it back into the dark. "I have come to say goodbye, Your Grace," she said. "Our terms are met. My father's name is cleared, my sister is safe, I am free to go, and you are free of me." "Yes," he said, to the fire, not to her. "You are free to go." She stood there. The fire ticked. Somewhere in the great house, a clock told the half-hour, and neither of them moved to fill the silence, and the silence stretched out and became the loudest thing in the room. And Eleanor thought of every silence she had ever shared with this man over 2 seasons of evenings, the comfortable ones, and the sharp ones, and the ones full of a thing neither of them had dared to name. And she made the last and largest choice of the whole long story. "I find," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, "that I do not wish to go. And I have spent 5 years being afraid to want things because everything I wanted was taken. And so I learned not to want. And it kept me safe. And it kept me grey. And I am very tired, Your Grace, of being grey." She took a breath. "You once said that a person's choosing tells you more about them than a year of their conversation. So here is my choosing. I came to take something from you, and I find I want to stay and give, not to pay a debt. The debt is closed. I want to stay because somewhere in 2 months of dull books and stubborn arguments, you became the only person alive who has heard me read since my father died, and closed your eyes, and thought, 'Now I have heard it properly. And I do not know what that is, and I am too frightened to give it a name. But I am done running from it. There. That is my choosing. Now you know me better than a year of my conversation would have told you, and you may do with it what you will." The Duke of Ashbourne rose from his chair. He crossed the room to her with that fearful, blind certainty, counting steps he had counted 1,000 times, and he stood close, and he lifted his hand and found, very gently, the side of her face. The way he had found everything for 2 years, by touch, by attention, by the patient hunting of a man who has learned that the most important things in the world cannot be seen. He traced the shape of her face that God had forbidden him to see, the tears on it, the unsteady mouth. And he said, in a voice gone soft, as I have ever heard a hard man's voice go, "Eleanor Hartley, I have spent 2 years and a fortune trying to find your face, so that I might look on the one person I most wronged and ask her forgiveness. And God, who has a colder humour than even I credited, arranged it so that on the very day she walked into my house, I lost forever the power to see her. I will never see your face. Do you understand what I am telling you? I will go to my grave never having seen the woman I—" He stopped and chose the word with all his old precision. "The woman I have come to love. And here is the strange grace of it, the thing I did not understand until this moment, with your tears under my hand. I do not need to see your face. I know you. I knew you before you told me your name. I knew you by the catch in your voice on the word you love too well to say smoothly. The same catch your father laughed about at a table where I was once, for one evening, happier than I have ever been before or since. I have been seen by a great many people, Eleanor, all my life, seen and weighed and wanted, for my title and my fortune and my power. You are the only person who ever knew me. There is a difference. I learned it too late to save your father. I am praying I have not learned it too late to keep you." And Eleanor Hartley, who had once read aloud in a warm, good house, while a lonely young man closed his eyes and learned what an unafraid evening sounded like, put her hand over the hand that was tracing her face, and held it there, against her cheek, and said, "You have not learned it too late." And the fire ticked, and the great dark house held its breath, and outside the tall windows the first snow of a new winter began, very quietly, to fall. They were married in the spring, in the small chapel near the churchyard, where Sir Thomas Hartley lay with his name made clean, so that he would be near, in whatever way the dead are near. Clara stood up with her sister, 15, and bright and breakable no longer, with a whole future opening in front of her like a road in good light. Mrs. Pruitt cried and pretended she had something in her eye, and was furious with anyone who noticed. And the Duke of Ashbourne could not see his bride come up the aisle, but he stood at the front of the chapel with his sightless face turned toward the door, and the moment her foot crossed the threshold, before anyone spoke, before any music told him, his whole body eased, because he had heard her step, the step that walked as though it were apologizing to the floor, and he smiled, and the people who had known him before the fire said they had not seen him smile in years. She read to him every evening for the rest of their lives, not as a hired voice, not as a deception, but as the choosing she had made in the firelight, renewed each night. And he closed his eyes when she read, though it made no difference to a blind man whether his eyes were open or shut, and he did it anyway, because it was the old gesture, the true one, the one that meant, "Now I have heard it properly." And sometimes she read from the green volume with her father's hand in the margins, and she would catch, still, on the word she loved too well to say smoothly, and her husband would reach across the dark and find her hand without being asked, every time, because he heard everything, and what he heard in that small catch was not grief any more. It was home. I have told you a great many stories, and I have learned that the saddest ones and the most hopeful ones are usually the same story told from different ends. Eleanor Hartley lost her father to a lie and could never get him back. That is the sad end. And Eleanor Hartley walked into the house of her enemy, carrying 5 years of hatred like a stone, and walked out, in the end, carrying something she had never thought to want, having given her father back his name, and found, in the giving, the life that had been waiting on the far side of her own courage. And that is the hopeful end. Both are true. They are the same story. The light, her father told her once, belongs to the person who carries it, and no one has the right to bargain with it. She carried it through 5 grey years into a dark house and gave it to a man who could not see. And he, who had ruined everything once by believing the worst, learned at last to know a soul without ever seeing a face. And if that is not a kind of sight, then I do not know what to call it, and I have been telling stories a very long time. So, we have come to the end, you and I, and the fire has burned down, and I find I am sorry to let you go. You stayed with me through 5 hard years and 2 seasons of grain tariffs, and a blind man learning to weep again, and that is no small thing, and I am grateful for it. Before you go back to wherever in the world you are, and I do mean it, tell me where. I love to know who has been sitting with me in the dark. Let me ask the one thing I always ask. If this story moved you, if Eleanor's long climb out of the grey put any kind of warmth in your chest, then do the small kind thing and subscribe to Jane Tells Stories, so that the next time I light the fire, you will be here to share it. And if you have come all this way with me, through all of it, and you still do not subscribe, well, then I am afraid you owe me a favour, and I always, always collect. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what you would have done in Eleanor's place. And come back soon, because I have another story already warming by the fire, and it is going to be a good one. Good night, my dears. The light belongs to the one who carries it. Carry yours well.